Welcome back to PLS 510. Today we are going to be talking about interpreting hay analyses, and we're going to use 5 hay samples taken in 2021 that are all going to be very good hay samples. And we're going to have the, the picture of the hay sample and the chemical report, the report from, in this case, Dairy One, a commercial laboratory beside it. And we're going to walk through those and talk about what they mean. First, let's talk about some things so we get at least fixed in our mind some cardinal values for cattle requirements. These graphs are from ID 101, Interpreting Forage Quality Reports, which is the University of Kentucky publication. And they are for a 1,000-pound beef cow and a 500-pound medium frame steer. Now, cows are somewhat bigger than 1,000 pounds for the most part in Kentucky right now, even up to 1,500 pounds in some cases. But if you look at the concentrations of TDN and crude protein in their diets or as they need it, this graph is still going to be fairly close to those requirements. Same thing for the 500-pound medium frame steer. So we've got a graph that shows the amount of TDN needed and crude protein needed for a cow, different stages. Dry, second trimester, so she's pregnant, but she's not lactating. She needs just barely, well, it's about actually, by calculating, about 48% TDN, which is a fairly average quality feed, and a crude protein of just about 7. As you move up in her production stage to late gestation, and then when she has calved, and if this gives us 3 different milk levels, then you can see the energy levels move up. So let's just take a look at, to fix in our head, a number to think about, and that is if we have something that's in the upper 50s for TDN for a beef cow, then we're going to be having at least a middle to average or average or better hay, because it's going to take care of the energy needs, which are most limiting in forages. Energy is most limiting. So it's going to take care of the energy needs, even of this mature average milking cow. Now, most cows these days are going to have better milk production than this. So 58% TDN won't do it, and you'll need to be supplementing. But so anywhere in that 58 to 60 is going to be a good hay energy-wise for a beef cow. Taking a look at crude protein, and you can see that for that same cow, they would need about 10% crude protein to somewhere around 11. So well, let's use 60 and 11 as the cardinal numbers for a beef cow, right? For a medium frame steer, then the energy levels just go up quite high as we're trying to put gain on these steers. So let's just use the 2 pounds of gain per day. That's going to be almost 70% TDN. And protein for 2 pounds a day is right about 15, okay? So 70 and 15 for the medium frame steer for them to gain. If we switch gears and talk about horses for a moment, this is from the Animal Science publication, Interpreting Forage, Formulating Rations for Horses. And it's got a similar listing of, horses in different stages over here on the left, then digestible energy needs, crude protein needs, and calcium and phosphorus needs. So what I'd like you to remember is that, and these are as fed, and when you see as fed in a text, like in a publication like this, then you would assume that that means 10% dry matter. 10% moisture. So in this case, if it's 0.90 megacals per pound, if our forage is 0.90 megacals per pound, if her needs are 0.90 megacals per pound on an as-fed basis, that's 90% dry matter, 10% moisture. That means it's going to have to be about 1 megacal per pound digestible energy on a dry matter basis. So you kind of have to plus up these numbers by about 11% to make that work. But for the most part, we're just trying to get that cardinal value in our heads. So let's just use 1 megacal per pound as the amount of energy needed for maintenance for a mature horse. And when we get up into, we'll say, lactating, then we're going to need something like 1.3 or 1.4 megacals per pound in order for that to take care of the lactating horse. So 1 megacal per pound for a maintenance in a horse, and 1.3 or 4 for the lactating horse. Crude protein numbers go up a little bit greater than we did for the beef cow, which you'll remember was about, let's just go back and look. For the crude protein needs for that average milk to somewhere in there is going to be about 10% crude protein. So if we had 10% crude protein forage, then we're going to be doing pretty good for most classes of cows, okay? And since, to keep this simple, we're just going to talk about mature animals. We're not going to really talk about steers, just because we can only keep a certain number of numbers in our head, at least I can at one time. So again, back for the cow, 60% TDN, 10% crude protein is going to be that number that we're going to say that's a good hay, okay? For a horse, 1 megacal per pound is going to take care of that maintenance for horse. But then let's take a look at the maintenance for the horse. She only needs about 8% protein. So if you look up here at the lactating horse, they need about 12.5. So we've said before that horses need more protein in the diet than cows because they don't get the benefit of the microbial protein that is generated in their hindgut as the ruminant does, because they're generating microbial protein in the front part of the digestive tract in the rumen, okay? So 1 megacal per pound is kind of the cutoff for the maintenance horse, and 1.3 or so for the lactating horse, and say 8 to 12 or 13% protein for the lactating horse. Now, calcium and phosphorus is needed in about a 2-to-1 ratio or so in the diet of horses, okay? And so we will see that our calcium needs here are somewhere between 0.27 to 0.8% of the diet, and phosphorus is 0.2 to 0.6. So we will keep these in mind just a little bit. Most of the time, we don't really worry about the calcium and phosphorus numbers in forages to deliver the calcium and phosphorus in the diet for a couple of reasons. First of all, usually we're supplementing the horse with minerals or with a concentrate that is going to be balanced for calcium and phosphorus, So let's take a look at these 5 hays. Now that we've kind of dialed in, well, no, we're going to take a look at a couple of other things first, but let's move on. All right, now I'm going to give you some secret tips for reading forage analyses, and we're going to test these out in the 5 samples that come next. And these are, I think, going to help you at least amaze your friends when you may look at forage analyses and you haven't seen the hay yet. And I will tell you this story. I had a call from a farm manager friend of mine, and he was anticipating a delivery of some hay from the west, and they told him it was about a 50-50 grass legume mix. And then all he was looking at was the analysis and the ADF. And so he sent that to me and he said, "Can you tell?" Well, I looked at that for quite a while. It's very difficult to tell composition from the analysis, but I'm going to give you 2 tricks that can help you do that. Number one, the ADF NDF difference is going to tell you the grass legume mix. If it's 10 or less, it's going to be mostly legume. If it's between 10 and 20, it's a grass legume typically, and 20 or more, mostly grass. And the thing that revealed that answer to me from my farm manager friend was the calcium and phosphorus ratio. Because if it's 1 to 1 or thereabouts, then it's going to be grass. If it's, say, between, well, 3 to 1 or greater, it's mostly legume. 2 to 1 or so, between 1 to 1 and 3 to 1, it's going to be a mix of grass and legume. So when I saw this hay analysis, it had a calcium phosphorus ratio of about 6 to 1. So what I told, and the protein content was moderate. So that's another clue, is that protein is going to be much higher for legumes in general, lower for grasses. Well, this particular hay had the protein kind of in the right range, but the calcium and phosphorus ratio was 6 to 1. And so I told my friend that here's what I think you're going to find when you see this hay. It's going to be a mature alfalfa hay because the protein numbers were somewhat moderate, but you're going to find it's almost pure alfalfa because of that wide calcium to phosphorus ratio. And in fact, when he saw it the next day, it was just exactly that. Now, sometimes I would almost always rather be lucky than good. In this case, maybe they coincided, but he sent me an analysis that did have some clues in it. So I'm revealing this to you so that you can amaze your friends and win forage trivia contests. Again, we've talked about having the nutrient requirements in mind, but let's talk about having an idea of what good hay is. And of course, good hay is going to have high protein. It's going to have an ADF, an acid detergent fiber, close to 30, okay? An NDF fiber close to 40 for pure legumes, 50 for pure grass. Legumes are nearly always going to have less NDF than grasses at the same stage of maturity. We're going to have a TDN of 58 or better for cattle. And remember that 58 to 60 was that TDN needed for that average milking cow. And a DE, a digestible energy, of 1.0 megacals per pound or greater for horses. And when you get to relative feed value, or RFV, if you get up to a 100 relative feed value for grasses, that is really, really good for a grass, especially those raised in Kentucky. If we get to be 125 or better for alfalfa, that's getting into the good alfalfa range. And really, some people would say it needs to be 150 or better to be good alfalfa. All right, so this is sample number 1. It's a bale of pure alfalfa from Kentucky. And actually, the Kentucky hays we are going to see are all going to come from the same farm. So this is the cross-section of the bale on the left, a close-up on the right, and you can see stems and you can see leaves. And the leaves are in fairly good shape. You can see they're still intact and whole, but they are bleached. And again, it'll become clear that color is an indicator, but it does not reveal the exact quality of the forage. In other words, a good hay can be brown, and a good hay and a green hay will be good, but a brown hay won't always be bad. Okay. All right, this is the forage analysis, and I've cut out the data from the report, and here's the close-up of the hay on the right. And next, I want to highlight some numbers in there, and let's just walk through that, okay? First of all, you're going to notice on any report that you're going to have 2 columns, an as-fed column and a dry matter column. Now, I've already gone into the need to convert from as-fed to dry matter when you read that in the text. And we did it with that Animal Science 115 publication that says that these are the requirements for as-fed. Because if you're measuring out a ration, you're gonna do it. In other words, with the moisture contents of the materials as they come to you. So they're not going to be oven dry, right, down to 0% moisture. They're going to have some moisture in them. So for concentrates, we typically assume that's about 10% moisture. For hay, It can vary, but as it turns out, hay that has uh, been allowed to cure fully and sit in a barn for some time will come down to between 10 and 15% moisture in Kentucky. But that's why you've got the two columns. Now, typically, when we're talking about trying to compare nutrient values, we're going to spend all of our time here in the dry matter column. Okay, so let's go through and take a look at some numbers. First of all, crude protein. And if you'll remember, a crude protein of somewhere around 8 to 10 is going to be excellent for cows, and say 10 to 12 is going to be enough, or say 9 to 10 to 12 or 13 will be enough for a horse. So in fact, I'll just tell you, all of the hays that you're going to see are going to have crude proteins well above those nutrients. In this case, this is 18.6 on a dry matter basis. We're going to skip some values here. These really come into play when we start worrying about whether or not, at least these upper ones do, whether or not the hay has heated or not. And to some degree, we're able to predict some things about whether a protein will degrade in the rumen or not. And alfalfa, just for example, has a lot of rumen degradable protein, which is going to then have to be cycled back into microbial protein if we want to have whole protein going down the GI tract. So less important for our purposes today. Then we're going to take a look at ADF and NDF, and perhaps these two are the most important two numbers on the report because they are measured entities, okay, measured. Almost everything else, well, calcium, the minerals are measured, the ash is measured, crude fat is measured, but a lot of the numbers that we use in terms of the crude protein is a calculated number. A lot of the numbers that we use are calculated numbers. Crude protein is, the TDN is, the relative feed value is, the horse digestible energy is, okay? So ADF and NDF are measured entities. We use ADF and NDF in equations to predict energy and intake in a lot of cases. So let's just take a look. We've got an ADF value of 32 versus 40 or 39. So this, I told you early on that a difference of 10 or less is going to indicate a pure legume. And in fact, that's what we have, okay? We're going to say that I also said that an ADF of 30 and an NDF of 40 is an indicator of a very good hay in Kentucky, and that would be, since the difference is 10, is a very good alfalfa hay, very good legume hay. ADF and NDF together are used to calculate relative feed value, and in this case, that 31.6 combined with a 39.3 is going to give us a relative feed value of 152, which for a Kentucky alfalfa is excellent. It's very high quality. Now we're going to talk about some numbers that are important, especially to horses, and they're going to have to do with the carbohydrate portion of this hay. We're going to look at these four numbers: the percent NFC, the percent starch, the percent water-soluble carbohydrates, and the percent ESC, which is ethanol-soluble carbohydrates, and that would be the simple sugars. ESC is a subset of water-soluble carbohydrates. And for the purposes of trying to determine whether or not a hay has low water-soluble carbohydrates for a horse, we're going to combine starch and water-soluble carbohydrates together to come up with the number. And nutritionists have sort of arbitrarily picked a number of 10% for the level of water-soluble carbohydrates that they would desire to have to try to keep from having excess glucose generated into the horse in the stomach and small intestine. So in this particular case, we've got a NFC, the total non-fiber carbohydrates of 31%, starch of 2, water-soluble carbohydrates of 3. So this is a forage that has a lot of non-fiber carbohydrates, some of which are going to be digestible by the horse in the foregut. Okay, now what's the difference between this NFC of 31 and we'll say this total soluble carbohydrates or digestible carbs of 10? That's going to be pectin and a few other more complex carbohydrates that are not digestible by monogastrics. In other words, not digestible in the small intestine and in the stomach. So but they are digestible in the hindgut. So they do contribute to energy, but not in the stomach and small intestine. So NFC of 31 in this case, and the starch of 2, water-soluble carbohydrates of 7.3. A TDN value of 62 for this hay, and which we said was going to be excellent for beef cattle. At this point in time, I need to remind you, or tell you for the first time in case this hasn't been said to you yet, that TDN equations between labs and among labs vary, and they vary greatly. And some are simple calculations from only from ADF, and some are much more complex that we call summative equations that take into account the amount of crude protein and its digestibility and so on. So the TDN value then needs to be interpreted somewhat carefully, and if you are doing this consistently for a client, for example, then you're going to want to know what TDN equation was used for the lab that you send the forage to and how to interpret that number. Again, we've said the relative feed value of 152, which is excellent. This is a pure alfalfa hay. The calcium and phosphorus ratio in this case is between 3 and 4 to 1. So that's consistent with our our little trick to gauge what the content of alfalfa is in this forage, which in this case is almost 100% and probably is 100%. Horse digestible energy in megacals per pound of about 1.14, which is going to be better than that needed for the horse at rest, or a light work horse, or a maintenance horse. So let's move on. This is a bale of hay from the same farm. It's a bale of alfalfa orchard grass, and you can see that over here in the close-up that you can see a bit more grass, but you can also see leaves, and they are also in good shape. This is the hay analysis at a bit more of a close-up there, showing more of the leaves that are present in the forage. You can see that some of these leaves, like this one, for example, have browned off, and that happens with orchard grass in the summer. Some of these are bright green, and of course you can see the alfalfa stems, which in this case are at least looking a little coarse right here. Walking through the forage analysis, we've got that moisture content of about 10, which is again indicating that it is fully stable in storage. It's fully dried out. A crude protein of this alfalfa orchard grass of almost 18%, which is just about the same as that pure alfalfa we saw before. So orchard grass leaves can be quite high in protein, and in this case, coupled with the alfalfa leaves, has kept that protein content for this sample at about 18%. Looking at the ADF-NDF difference here, we're about 35.5 for ADF, 47.4 for NDF. That difference is about 12. And remember by our trick that anything between 10 and 12 indicates a mix. Closer to 10 indicates that there is a fairly good amount or a high amount of legume in that forage compared to grass. We're going to have another clue down here that would indicate the same thing. If you look at our carbohydrate fractions compared to the forage before, this has a little bit less in both non-fiber carbohydrates and in starch and water-soluble carbs. A good TDN value, almost identical to the alfalfa in the previous sample. Now, I would say to you that if you were to submit this sample or give these values or take this sample to another lab, you could generate a different kind of a TDN number, again, because of the kind of equations used by the laboratories. A relative feed value of 120, which was, we said for our good hays, we kind of put an arbitrary value of 125. You could have said 120. That this is a very good hay, So a relative feed value of 120. And as a reminder, relative feed value is calculated exclusively from ADF and NDF. Calcium phosphorus ratio here of 4 to 1. So in this case, we know we have grass, but we've got a lot of legume to keep that calcium phosphorus ratio then at greater than 1 to 1, okay? And a horse digestible energy of 1.05. So this is going to be a excellent horse hay, a little lower in energy than the pure alfalfa hay, and certainly enough all by itself for a horse at maintenance. This is actually, ironically, a bale of hay that is alfalfa orchard grass from that same farm. So all three of the samples you've seen up to this point are Kentucky samples and from the same farm. This actually was a sample of hay from Mill Ridge. They purchased from that Kentucky farmer, and this is the full cross section on the left, the close-up on the right. And you can see again in this case, this looks like to me, and I'm trying to visually shut out on the left because I'm trying to stay fair. This looks like it's a heavier orchard grass mix than the bale before, at least right here in this cross section. So let's take a look at what we see. Again, a moisture content of about 10, and again, indicating this is fully dried out hay, okay? If we were closer to, say, the baling, or right after baling, or within a month or two of baling, we might expect that to be 15. Crude protein of 18.9. So even if this is mostly grass, it is really good grass, okay, to keep the protein up around 18.9. An ADF NDF of 33.5 and 50.6, a differential here that's approaching 20, okay? And remember from our trick that a differential of 20 between ADF and NDF indicates mostly grass. So here we've got something between 10 and 20, so that indicates a mix. And because it's close to 20, then we would say it is, probably more than 50% grass, and that's visually what we see. Non-fiber carbohydrate numbers that are a little bit lower, I believe, than the hay sample we just saw. Certainly the starch and water-soluble carbs are lower. TDN of almost identical to that alfalfa orchard grass hay in the previous sample. Relative feed value of 115. Again, that's very close to the relative feed value of the hay before. And since we said a relative feed value of 100 for a grass is really good. For most of our grass hays that you see, you're not going to see, the RFV will be 100 or less. In this case, this is an excellent grass hay, and the relative feed value is 115. Calcium phosphorus ratio of about 0.8 versus 0.3, about 2 to 1, which indicates to me that it is a mix, and more grass, I think, closer to 1 to 1 than 3 to 1, 4 to 1, indicates it's probably mostly grass, okay? And it looks that way to us. The horse digestible energy of about 1 megacal per pound. So this forage alone would be adequate for that horse at maintenance. Now we're going to take a look at 2 Western hays, and you're going to have to discount the color just a little bit. Now it is honestly greener, but these pictures were taken under artificial light, and it's very difficult to, in the conditions that I was working in, to get pictures where the colors are perfectly true to the bale itself. This is from Mill Ridge. It is a Western mix of grass and alfalfa, orchard grass and alfalfa. And this from the left side of the barn, which is my clue that this was supposed to be a bale that had a little more alfalfa. If you look over here at the close-up on the right, what we mainly see is grass. But again, this is just one cross-section of a bale that weighs 100 pounds. So again, cross-section, that close-up of the bale on the right and the analysis on the left. In this case, this is Western hay, and their moisture content is 7. So one of the things that we know about Western hay is the drying conditions are much better. And so this indicates, in this case, the moisture was 7, right? Crude protein for this, it looks like a lot of grass here, is almost 20%, which is, just sky high. ADF of 31.9, NDF of 52.0. That differential is exactly 20, very close, 19.9. And so that indicates that this is probably at least almost 100% grass. So, which squares up with what we see here on the right, okay? Non-fibrous carbohydrates of 13.4. Now, the 3 samples we've seen before have been either alfalfa or alfalfa orchard grass, and their non-fiber carbohydrates are somewhere between, well, roughly 20% and 30%. In this case, our mostly grass sample here has a non-fiber carbohydrate of about 13.4, and a starch plus water soluble carbohydrates of that's about 1, say 8.5. And in general, if we're trying to find or use a low or a hay that is good for insulin resistant horses, metabolic syndrome horses, orchard grass is often a good choice because it tends to have lower water soluble carbohydrates and starch. So that's, of course, that fraction of the forage that's going to be digested in the stomach and the small intestine. A TDN in this case of 66, and again, you would not expect a pure grass hay to have a TDN this high compared to a good alfalfa, and that's exactly what we saw in the previous 3 samples. And again, I'm probably spending more emphasis or putting more emphasis on this than makes sense to you at this stage. But Dairy 1 in particular has a very unusual, at least in our judgment, calculation for TDN. And if you want to know more about that, we can talk about that later. And in fact, I do mention that in more specifics in another lecture. The relative feed value for this, mostly grass hay is 115. And again, from our little cheat sheet for good hay, a grass hay with a relative feed value of more than 100 is, I usually call it smoking good. So in this case, this is just an unbelievable bale of hay. Now, there is some alfalfa in it, and of course, Western hays are going to be exceptional. In this case, you can see that it's all leaves, and we see very little, there's a little bit right there, very little of that brown orchard grass leaf that we saw in the Kentucky sample. And that means we're going to have, a much higher quality hay. Calcium phosphorus ratio of, not quite 2 to 1, well, pretty close. So indicating that, this is mostly grass with some alfalfa in it, and the horse digestible energy of 0.96. So again, a good match just for this hay alone for a horse at maintenance. And the final hay is this Mill Ridge Western mix on the right side of the barn. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if you look at this close-up, this is supposed to be actually a less alfalfa in the bale than the sample we just saw. Okay, but what I see in this little particular cross section is, see those leaves right there? I see quite a bit more evidence of alfalfa, at least right there. And you know, this points up the challenge with taking one bale and saying this represents the whole lot. Okay, it's also the reason that we want to take a lot of cores, cross-section cores of bales, of a group of hay bales, in order to really describe chemically what's in that lot of hay. Let's take a look at our last hay bale. This is also a Western hay, and as we said, it's from Mill Ridge, and in this one was supposed to be less alfalfa than the hay sample that we saw before. And as you can see, we do see this alfalfa, set of alfalfa leaves right here, and with mostly grass and certainly a nice looking bale of hay. A moisture content of 8.4, again, very dry, 16.6, so a little bit lower than the hay sample that we saw immediately before. And it reminds me at this point in time that I need to tell you that we're looking at one bale, of course, in these pictures, but the hay analyses are going to be coming, at least for these Western hay mixes, are going to be coming from a number of bales. So we consolidated 10 samples or 10 cores from this lot of hay. So there is a bit of a need to at least put an asterisk by our interpretation that this particular bale should match up 100% with the numbers that we see here on the left. If all the bales are exactly alike, they should, but there could be some variation from bale to bale, especially in a hay field that has a mix of alfalfa and orchard grass in it. So taking a look at the crude protein, 16.6 again is going to be more protein than we need for horses at almost any stage or cattle at almost any stage, right? Taking a look at NDF and ADF, the differential between, I guess should say ADF and NDF differential. We got an ADF of 28.7, an NDF of 45.2. That's about, well, that's 29, 16, difference of 16 or so. So that puts it in that middle between, it's not 10. The differential of 10 would be pure legume. A differential of 20 or more would say that's probably mostly grass. This one puts us clearly in that alfalfa grass range, and that's what we see here on the right. Non-fiber carbohydrates of 22.9, starch of 0.6, water-soluble carbs of 14.8. And this is a little different. It looks quite a bit different than the hay sample before, and I'm just going to back up to remind you. This is going to be Mill Ridge, it's kind of probably from the same farm, supposed to be a little more alfalfa in the mix. We got lower non-fiber carbohydrates and lower, in particular, water-soluble carbohydrates than this other sample that we are currently talking about. So let's, and what does that mean? It points up the difficulty of trying to find these really, really low starch plus water-soluble carbohydrate bales. In this case, this one we'd expect it to act very differently when, say, a metabolic horse consumed this set of hay, because we've got this much carbohydrate then that will be able to be metabolized or digested down to glucose in the stomach and small intestine. A TDN number of 66. Again, the TDN calculations vary from laboratory to laboratory. Dairy One has a particularly unusual set of equations for this. And as we will see in another lecture, the we do interpret that TDN numbers with a grain of salt when we look at the labs that return values to us. So if you are working with clientele and you're trying to interpret TDN numbers for them or for your own feeding purposes, then of course you're going to need to know what equation was used and how to interpret that number. Relative feed value of 137. And again, let's go back to the hay before. Relative feed value of 115 compared to 137. So this is another indicator that, in fact, this lot of hay that's supposed to be lower in quality, higher in grass, with less alfalfa, clearly has more alfalfa, at least in the bales that I sampled, because you've got a relative feed value of 137, which is getting up close to, you know, that pure alfalfa range. And a calcium phosphorus ratio that's about 4:1. So you've got a lot of indicators here that there's quite a bit of legume in this sample. Again, that ADF NDF differential of about 16, high relative feed value, 4:1 calcium to phosphorus ratio, and then a horse digestible energy of greater than 1. So again, this hay would be great for horses and would take care of the needs of that maintenance horse for sure. So this is going to conclude this walkthrough of 5 different Kentucky samples and their hay analyses.